Okay, welcome to the second session. My name is Julieta Vela. I'm postdoc at the Universidad de Buenos Aires in Argentina, and I'm part of this organizing group. Okay, now I will present to the Dr. Esteban Moro. He's a researcher, data scientist, a professor at Universidad Carlos III of Madrid in Spain, and visiting professor at MIT. He works in the intersection of big data and computational social science with special attention to human dynamics, collective intelligence, social networks, and urban mobility in problems like viral marketing, natural disaster management, or economical segregation in cities. His talk is entitled Resilient Social System in Urban Areas from Social Segregation to Labor Markets. Welcome, Esteban.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you. Let me share my screen. I just need a confirmation that everything is working. So can you see my screen? And can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me today. First of all, I have to apologize because I'm not coming from the food, let's say, community. But although we are collaborating right now with people which are working on nutrition to understand the food access and the inequities that are actually happening in the food access in cities. Today we're going to talk. I'm going to talk about the research we have been doing using big data to understand the resilience of social systems in urban areas, and specifically in two dimensions. The first one is social segregation, and the other one is labor markets. So once again, my name is Esteban Moro, and I'm a professor at Universidad Carlos III de Madrid, and also a visiting professor at MIT Media Lab. And I've been there actually for the last 4 years. Okay, so by 2050, I mean, before the pandemic, actually, the predictions were that by 2050, 75% of us are going to be living in a major city. And by major city, I'm not saying a city of 100,000 people. We are talking about that in the whole world, people are going to be living in cities which are of the size of millions. Obviously, that such big cities are going to have that those urban systems are going to have clearly major problems, which are already happening right now in those major cities. And most of us are going to be impacted by probably one or two or three of those problems that you can see there in the list. The agencies have been working on detecting those problems and trying to address those problems to create more resilient cities in the future. And for example, I bring you the last European Commission report about the future of cities in April last year, in which they actually outline 7 major problems: environmental impact, aging, housing, new forms of governance, mobility, and also social segregation. And I added also another 2 major problems, which are labor markets, and of course, very recently, epidemics. Epidemics is one of the problems that actually has a huge footprint in our cities. Whenever you see all these reports about the future of cities, I have the impression that most of the reports talk about places. They talk about the library, they talk about this park, they talk about the roads, they talk about the highways that we need, they talk about having, I don't know, the last mile delivery, having Uber, etc. They talk about places, transportation, etc. But there is one part which is missing in most of these problems, which is the part about behavior, the part about interaction. At the end of the day, cities are social machines. We live in a city because we want to interact with other people. We want to actually create value in setting up our company there or our business, etc. So most of what is happening in cities is not these bricks, these roads, and these trees. It's the actual behavior of people. In the last years, unfortunately, there has been one of the major problems in cities is social segregation. It's not only happening in urban areas. I mean, here I bring you the typical plot that you can see, for example, in social media, in which one group of people, like blue dots.
Esteban,
yes.
I'm really sorry, but we are not seeing your screen. I think you should restart your presentation.
Okay, let me.
Sorry.
Share the screen. No worries. Let me see if I can do it again. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, no, yeah. Perfect.
Can you
Thank
see
you
that?
so much.
Okay, well, this is what I was saying. You can see the report, but this is nothing new. So basically, when you look at the cities, I mean, this is actually what is happening in our cities. This is actually social media, which is another, let's say, the fourth, let's say, dimension of the other dimension of online interactions. What you see is that people of one specific group or one characteristic, like for example, political views or economic income or education, or even, for example, race, they get together and talk between themselves while the other groups are actually doing the same thing, but there's little interaction between those two groups. This is actually one of the major problems that is happening in our cities and in our societies. And I can tell you, for example, that economic segregation in cities is increasing all over the world, while, for example, racial segregation is decreasing all over the world. So we are creating less and less homogeneous places, less homogeneous social machines in our cities than we did in the past. You might think that this is probably not something that is not new. Social segregation has been happening a lot in our cities for the last centuries, but I can tell you that the social segregation right now has a tremendous cost for our cities. Areas and cities we have segregation have higher homicide rates. They tend to grow economically slower. They actually tend to be less innovative in the future, even though cities probably which are segregated right now are very innovative. In the future are going to be less innovative. But not only because as a whole cities might be impacted by this segregation, but also the people which are living in low income, in highly segregated areas, they tend to live less, or they tend to have, for example, less secondary education. This is actually a problem because people get trapped by the random, let's say, event of happening to be born in those areas. So not only there's a moral and ethical concerns, I mean, reasons why we have to investigate segregation in our cities, we also have economic problems associated with those. But as I was saying, when you look at the problem of segregation in cities, this is the picture that most people have in mind. The picture is that you have a rich neighborhood, which is the one on the right, close to a slum-like poor neighborhood, which is the one you have on the left. People are talking about bricks. People are talking about roads. People are talking about neighborhoods. But they're not saying what are the people on the right side doing on the left side or the other way around. Are they, for example, interacting? Are they living apart? Or are they, for example, meeting in the local library? So this is the project that we started 2 years ago. We wanted to understand how people are exposed to other people in the cities, how people are actually visiting the same places or not in the city. Rather than just looking at where people live, we want to see what people do and who are they interacting with. So we got data coming from mobile phone applications in these 11 major cities in the United States. It comes from around 5 million users, and we have 6 months of data. It's a humongous data set that allow us to track where people are going and where are places that people visited. With that information, we found something which is very striking, is that 75% of the people that we encounter daily in our daily lives live more than 15 kilometers away from us. So that means that most of the people that we interact with, think about the people that you work, think about the people that you go to a concert with, or the people that you, I don't know, go and have a game during the weekends. Most of these people live far away from you. So if we want to understand segregation in the cities, we have to stop thinking about neighborhoods. We have to start thinking about what we do when we are 15 kilometers away from our neighborhoods. And basically, the question that we want to answer is that if we are 15 kilometers away most of the time, interacting with people that are living actually 15 kilometers away, we want to understand if there is segregation, we want to understand where and why this is happening. So once again, the data that we have is very, very precise. I mean, we can determine the location of the people around the city, and we can actually see where a person visits a place. In this case, for example, a pizza place. But looking at the total number of people that visit a place, we can build the economic profile of the groups which are visiting that place. And with that economic profile, we can actually see how integrated is this place. Think about, and this transparency where I'm talking is basically, we can compute the Gini coefficient, the Gini index, the economic inequality index by place. So we can tell you how your favorite pizza place is integrated or not according to the income of the people that visit that pizza place. With that, we define a very simple metric of inequality, which basically tells you that if you go to a place and you find people from all over the income groups, then this place is very equal. And a very unequal place is those in which you basically see only people coming from one economic group. Okay. With that, we actually built a platform that you can visit. It's online. It's called inequality.media.mit.edu, in which we classify all the around 2 million places in the United States according to this integration index. So you can see here, this is downtown Manhattan. So you can see the Isle of Manhattan here. You can see the Bronx. You can see also Brooklyn here. And each of the dots that you see here is a POI, is a point of interest, which could be a restaurant, it could be an office, it could be a shopping place, it could be a school. And the color indicate how integrated is this place. Red means that the place is very unequal, is low integrated, and most of the people that visit that place is coming just from one income group. Blue means that the place is actually visited by all the income groups in the city. And you can see many things here. I mean, you can see also 11 cities in the United States, and we are actually extending this also to Mexico City in the near future. Let me tell you two things that we found here. The first thing that we found is that actually you can just cross the street. You can go from one side of the street to the other side of the street, and you can completely see different people. You can go, for example, this is actually the place where I usually go for lunch around the Media Lab at MIT. And there are two places here. One is a vegetarian restaurant, and the other one is a Mexican fast food place. And the integration and the social segregation in those places is completely different. Okay, and those places are 15 meters apart. Okay, and also you can get a sandwich or the equivalent of a sandwich in those places for the same price. So segregation is not happening at neighborhood level. It's actually happening at the street level, even just next door. It's happening. Okay. And the other thing that we found is actually the category of the place, the type of place that you go impacts a lot the segregation of the place. This is a very messy plot. Let me explain it. Each dot here is the average segregation of all the places which are characterized as a simple category here. For example, grocery stores. You can see grocery stores here. Okay, this is the dimension you see here. The vertical dimension is the average segregation of all these places, and the horizontal dimension is basically the distance you have to travel to get there. So this is basically how unique are those places in the city. You can see, for example, there is a very strong correlation between segregation and the distance you have to travel. You can see things here which are expected, like for example, local places, neighborhood places are much more segregated. Like for example, religious places, schools, and grocery stores. You can also see here that unique places, like for example, terminal, train stations, or science museums, etc., are less segregated because because there's only one of them in the city. But not everything is explained by accessibility. You can see, for example, here that working places, like offices or factories or warehouse, typically people expend or take 18 to 20 kilometers to go to those places, but they are very different in terms of segregation. For example, you can travel to your office and be less segregated than if you travel to a factory. So the type of places that you visit impacts a lot. It's so that even the type of restaurant that you go to will impact your segregation. The most segregated restaurants in the United States are actually the Spanish and the Caribbean and the fast food places. And the less segregated are New American, Steakhouse, Gastropub, and Tex-Mex. Once again, you see this correlation between accessibility and segregation. This is a plot when I saw this plot to the people which are working in nutrition, we call this the tale of two segregations, because not only people that go to these fast food places are more segregated, but also they are having food which is, from the nutritional point of view, is worse. Okay. But the most interesting part of this project is why. I mean, we know that going to a fast food place in your neighborhood probably is you're gonna only find people from your neighborhood and you're gonna be segregated. The reason is why there are people that even when they live in the same area, they are completely having different segregation profiles. So what we did basically to compute for each individual in our database, we compute what is the income profile of the people that I'm exposed to. Actually, I did it on myself. Actually, I took all the places that I went, I computed the people that went to those places, and I can tell you which is the type of place that I see, the type of people that I see every day. And for that people, we can compute inequality. A person which is very unequal is a person which only sees people from their own, let's say, income group. A people which is very equal is a people which is exposed to all the income profiles in the city. What we try to do is to explain that segregation, that inequality, that individual inequality as a function of a number of variables. You can see here the groups that we're using, the residential, the geographical, and the places which we visited. The first one is basically the typical, your income, your race, your educational level, the means of transportation, etc. We also use the geographical mobility. I mean, how far you went in the city, what is the typical distance you travel every day. But also we wanted to know what is the impact of the lifestyle, the type of places that you visit, whether you go to a museum or not, whether you like sports, whether you like to go on places during the night or to restaurants during the weekend, or for example, a movie place, a movie theater. And what we found is striking, is that the experience segregation of people only depends 45% on your residential properties, on the place where you live. For example, and the rest, the behavioral properties like the choices, the venues you visited, and also the mobility patterns, accounts for more than the half of the segregation that we see. So being segregated depends a lot on your income, of course, on education and on the region you live, but most of it comes from your lifestyle. Most of it comes from the choices that you make around the city. For example, I can tell you that in our models, knowing that you went once to a museum last year tells me more about your segregation than your income. So this is the level of the importance of the behavioral features in understanding segregation in cities. Okay. So this is the first project that is trying to understand how this social fabric, how these networks might be more or less resilient towards these segregation patterns. And the second project that I'm going to talk about is about labor markets, labor market in city. This is a project that I have done with other researchers, also at the Media Lab, UC3M. And labor market is also a big problem in our cities. And probably most of you know that before the pandemic, but obviously during the pandemic, a number of people have lost their jobs. A number of industries have been severely affected by the impact of the pandemic. But before the pandemic, we also have another major forces that were actually impacting the labor markets. One is, for example, that most of the, for example, jobs that were important in our cities, like, for example, these middle income jobs, like managerial jobs, clerk jobs in banks, etc., are disappearing. And there's a number of people which are worried about the future of work. You can see the statistics here. And 75% of the Americans, for example, there will be no new jobs. And actually what is happening is that since the year 2000, most of the salaries, most of the median income in the cities are actually stalled, and while the productivity is really increasing, the salaries are stalled. The reason for that is that most of the jobs in the cities have been impacted by for example, forces like automation, or the fact that there has been a major decline in these middle, let's say, income jobs, clerk, let's say, managerial jobs in cities. So in order to understand how we can actually understand what has been the impact of these major forces in the cities, we started to build a model to understand how resilient are cities to these major forces of unemployment or labor shocks. And this model is actually inspired in ecological networks. And the ecological network that we have here is basically an ecological network between occupations and skills. Basically, what happens is that each of the occupations that we have in our cities is a bag of skills. And it can be described, for example, an occupation like, for example, teaching can be described as obviously you have to know how to teach, you have to know how to present, you have to know, for example, to speak English if necessary, etc. So each occupation is a bag of skills. Changing from one occupation to another means that you have skills that can allow you to transition from one occupation to another. And by using this mapping between occupation and skills, we can build what we call the job-job network, which tells you how easy it is to transition from one job to another. Okay, and this is the job-job network. This is basically using the data that is available in the United States about the description of each job and the skills required to fill that job. We build this network, in which you can see a lot of dots here. Each of it corresponds to a particular job, and you see the links between jobs, which basically tell us how similar are jobs in terms of skills. So you can see, for example, all the jobs here which are green, which are related to construction, and you can see here, for example, all the jobs which are here dark green, which are related to computer and mathematical occupations. So you can see that they are close together because they are easy to transition from one place to another. One thing that you can see here is that there's a huge gap between these two sides. Okay, so there's a lot of jobs which are clustered together, and they actually rely a lot on cognitive skills. They rely, for example, on skills that have to do with analytical thinking, with creative, with innovation, with mathematics, with technology, etc. And there's another set of jobs which are the ones on the left, which are more physical. They rely on the fact that you can, for example, stand up for a number of times. So you are, for example, very good with tools, etc. Okay, so it's not easy to transition from physical to cognitive. The other thing that we did is to actually rely on a model, and we are going to build a model that tell us how people transition from one job to another. This is not a model that we invented. We actually were lucky to build on the shoulders of giants here. Actually, we built on the shoulders of Mortensen and Pisaridis. We received the Nobel Prize in Economics for this model 5 years ago. Basically, this model tells us that the number of people that flows from one job to another is basically given by the number of employed people in one job and the number of unemployed people in the other job. Okay, and this is weighted by the similarity between the jobs. So with that, we can build an ecological model, and most of you probably that are working in ecological network ecological models recognize this is a kind of lockable Terra models that tell us how people transition from one job to another. Okay, you can see here that the number of employed people in one job grows as a function of the number of people that transition from other jobs to that job, but also there is a let's say a spontaneous, let's say, number of people that decay and they lose the jobs in each of the jobs. And the same thing for unemployed people. Okay, so you have this couple of equations which are happening on this network. The good thing is that these equations are different for different cities. So in different cities, the networks are different. And the reason why the networks are different is because different cities have different sectors, or they have sectors which are much more represented than the other cities. For example, this is the ecological network of jobs, or the job-job networks in two different cities. One is in Hinesville in Georgia, and the other one is in New York, in New York City, in the New York State. What you can see here is that the network in Hinesville is actually very sparse. See, actually, some of the jobs that you see there have no connections with other jobs. So that means that if you lost your job there, it will be very hard for you to transition to the jobs. But if you live in New York, I mean, you have the chances to transition to many other jobs. We quantify the probability of transitioning to other jobs by this WF, which is basically coming out of the equation. I'm not going to go through the details, but basically from the equation, you can derive this, let's say, connectivity metric. We tell us that the connectivity metric, or the WF, or what we call the job connectivity network, the job network connectivity, is very small in the Hinesville in Georgia, but it's very high in New York. And what we did is basically to study what is the impact of unemployment shocks in the different cities. And you can see basically that if you live in New York, the unemployment shocks there, if there's an homogeneous unemployment, homogeneous employment shock, you are better off living in New York than you live in Hinesville, Georgia. And the reason is because if you're impacted in Hinesville, Georgia, probably the chances to transition to other job are very, very small. Okay, and actually, this is just coming from the model, but we also compare what happened during the financial crisis in 2008. And we compare the change in employment in the cities with this metric that we devised, which is this job connectivity, let's say, job connectivity metric. And what we found is actually there's a huge correlation between the change in unemployment the cities with these metrics, meaning that this metric is actually measuring the resilience of city towards these unemployment shocks. Not only that, we also measure what could be the future. What could be, for example, the future if we reach a stage in which most of the jobs are going to be automated. There are some jobs which are going to be automated for sure. Some others are don't, and different jobs have different probability to be automated. So what happens when an automation shock happens is that unemployment actually rise a lot in cities. For example, think about if all the truck drivers are automated by using these self-driving trucks, then all the drivers are going to be actually unemployed. But then something happened is that because of this, people have these skills, maybe they can be relocated in another job. So you can have this recovery in the cities. But if you live in a city in which there's no potential, let's say, transition to other jobs, you can actually be in a situation that is actually even worse. This automation is actually creating more unemployment in the future. Well, we measure these automation shocks in the cities, and there's a lot of plots here. But basically, what we found is that cities which are small, like for example, Hinesville in Georgia, because they are more fragile, they have more fragile networks. The automation shocks are going to be really. Not only they are going to be important at the beginning because a lot of people are going to be unemployed, but also they're going to create more unemployment. And the reason for that is that the people that are actually unemployed are going to be creating this are going to be effectively removed from the network, and also that people are going to be that is going to create less opportunities in the city, and the people which were already in a job, because I mean, out of the blue, some of the industries there could disappear, do not have other jobs to get to. So small cities or cities which have less job connectivity are going to be more impacted by this automation. In bigger cities, like for example, New York, although the impact of unemployment is going to be big at the beginning, they can recover much easily. Okay, so this is basically the research that we are doing. We have many other projects in our group, but basically the conclusion is that if we want to create more resilient cities, we have to investigate these networks of either how people transition between jobs or how people interact between them. The first one and the first project is about how this network is segregated. We have to actually create less segregated network, and we have to understand where is the region of those segregation. And what we found is actually the region is encoded into the lifestyles. So if we want to design interventions, we want to create more resilient cities, we have to stop thinking about bricks. We have to stop thinking about building another park and building another library, unless after building the library, we are really monitoring how the behaviors of people are changing because of that library. Also, there's another thing that it's very important in our cities is that more and more people are actually using recommendation algorithms to know what to do in the cities. I mean, like for example, we are using Uber to drive around the city. We are using a lot of food delivery to get food around the cities, etc. So we have to think what is the interrelation between those recommendation algorithms and our lifestyles, and actually that effect on the segregation. This is a project that we are doing right now. On the labor markets, how we can create cities in which everybody has a permanent job, has a resilient job. Okay, and the policies that we have to put in place to create those more robust and more resilient cities in terms of labor, it should be to promote skills and jobs that create this job network more robust, that create this job network more dense. Okay, so one of the things that we can do, for example, is that if you live in a small city, you probably are in a sparse, let's say, job network. But one of the things that we can do is we can entangle this small city with the job network of all the bigger areas to make the labor market more robust. Okay, and we are working also on those directions. So thank you very much for this opportunity to present our results, and I'm open to questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Esteban. Super interesting, your talk. Now is the time of question.
So, Esteban, thank you very much. Unfortunately, Julia can't see the question and answers session, but I can. So I'm going to chip in on her behalf. Apologies to those listening in. Okay, so I've got two questions here. Are the numbers, for example, the 15-kilometer distance normalized by factors such as the population number, city size and city spread? Would you expect slightly different numbers in other cities around the world? That's the first question. And then the second, is there data on the temporal changes in these patterns? For example, segregational changes in time?
Okay, very good questions. Thank you. The first one is that we are, I mean, the research that we have done is concentrated on major urban areas. Is because the data that we have has more penetration in those urban areas. So that means that we have more representativity of the results. There is a little bit of variation in the typical distance that people travel in those cities. Especially has to do with the extent of the public transportation systems in different cities. But we have actually checked that that actually does not impact the number of also does that number that I gave, which is 15 minutes. Also, don't take these 15 kilometers as a I don't know, a number written in stone. I mean, the variation could be between 10 and 20 kilometers. For example, in the US, the typical commuting distance is around 30 kilometers. So that means that there's a lot of people which are actually taking much more distance than we have. But what I'm trying to say with this number is that it's not 1 kilometer, and it's not, let's say, your neighborhood. It's actually far away from your neighborhood. The other one about segregation is that we have data for the data that I'm showing you is just 6 months of data. So we wanted to have a snapshot of the city. But right now what we're doing is to take different years and see how the segregation, and I have a news, the segregation is actually increasing much more. We tended to do much more random things in the past, or we tended to actually take the bus in the past. We tended to go to the mall, and those events created less segregation in the cities. Now we are shopping more online. We're taking Uber to move around the cities, and we go less and less to recreational places. So the segregation is actually increasing in cities. Not only, for example, in this, let's say, free time, but also in the workplaces. The working places are actually becoming more and more segregated. It used to be that the workplace was the first time in which you basically meet people from all over the place, and it's not true anymore. Working places are becoming more segregated in the US.
Thank you so much. There's been lots of interesting comments. I think there's minds buzzing at the moment by your talk and the data and everything you showed. So thank you so much.